what we want to look at here, and that is 2 Kings 6, verse 8 to 17. And it is primarily around an issue with Elisha, the Syrian king, and one of Elijah's servants, and how he, and then being fearful, and how God fixed and sorted out the fears that they were having. Somebody can keep in the time so that we do or agree half an hour. So I read for ease. Then the king of Syria warred against Israel, and took counsel with his servants, saying, in such and such a place shall be my camp. And the man of God sent unto the king of Israel, saying, beware that thou pass not such a place, for thither the Syrians are come down. And the king of Israel sent to the place which the man of God told him, and warned him of, and saved himself there, not once or twice. Therefore, the heart of the king of Syria was sore troubled for this thing. And he called his servants and said unto them, will ye not show me which of us is for the king of Israel? And one of the servants said, none, my lord, O king. But Elisha, the prophet that is in Israel, telleth the king of Israel the words that thou speakest in thy bed chamber. And he said, go and spy where he is, that I may send and fetch him. And it was told him, saying, behold, he is in Dothan. Therefore sent he to the horses and chariots and great hosts, and they came by night and compassed the city about. And when the servants of the man of God was risen early, and gone forth, behold, a host compassed the city, both with horses and chariots. And his servant said unto him, alas, my master, how shall we do? And he answered, fear not, for they that be with us are more than they that be with them. And Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray thee, open his eyes, that he may see. And the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. Wherefore I put thee in remembrance, that thou stir up the gift of God, which is in thee, by the putting on of my hands. For God hath not given us a spirit of fear, but power and of love and of a sound mind. And so the topic today is freedom from fear. Anybody listening to the story? Anything that you probably never took note of before jump out at you about? Yes. Anybody? Perhaps they shouldn't be able to teach us, so it has to be in her view, the students. All right. So this story, told from the book of Kings, has to do with the continued war that existed over time between Syria and Israel. So it is like one of the installments of battle between the two sides, the two nations. Israel, who would have been God's people, and the Assyrians, who would have represented the enemy of God. And so here is Elisha, the man that God would have used, the servant of God in that season. Elisha found out through God's directive and God's direction where the next battle was going to be taking place. And Elisha sent and warned the king. And not only the scripture said, he didn't warn him, the king was saved and Israel was saved. Not once or not twice, But we can stretch our imagination and say it could be from 3 times to how many times, I don't know. So Elisha found out what the plan of the king was. And I'm going to give you a very easy question because it was read in the scriptures in case you were listening. How did Elisha know where the Syrian army was? How did Elisha know? How did Elisha know where the Syrian army was? Alright, so it's an easy answer. Even if you were guessing, we could say God revealed it to him. But that would have been the answer because nobody told him. He saw what the king was doing while the king was in his bed chamber. So therefore, it is that Elisha crept up and went into the room or into his bed chamber, which I suspect is his bedroom, and told him what was happening. Simply, God showed Elisha what was happening in terms of the points where the battles should have taken place. And so the king got disturbed in his mind, and the king said, some spy must be in Syria, telling our business to the king of Israel. And the king, as they usually are, would have been very upset, and so he called whoever would have advised him. And somebody who had sense said to the king, King, no, it doesn't have anything to do with any one of us being spies. Or in Jamaica terms, what we would say. Anybody being what? Informer, right. And some people would say the person who rat out the other person, right? Tell on the other person. So one servant of the king said to him, don't worry about informer, don't worry about spy. That man named Elisha down in Israel is able to see things that nobody showed him, and so on. So the king of Israel got upset and said, all right, send for that man. And he sent for the one man. But the king must have been smart because he didn't send for him lightly. He sent for him with a massive army. And when he sent for him with a massive army, one of Elisha's servants saw this army and started to get worried and was fearful and was demonstrating that he was not free from fear. And so he said to Elisha, tell me what is happening, how we going to manage? Because those that are arrayed against Israel, or those who come for you, it will appear as though the army that came for Elisha look like it is the whole of Israel that come to fight against. Because there were chariots, let me see, compass the city. It's the whole city there that they surrounded, both with horses and chariots. And so a full army was there for one man, for Elisha. And so part of what we must accept as children of God, when we are in the position that we are, there is result. And I'm emphasizing the result part because a lot of people will tell you that they are in touch with God and their spirits are attuned and they see and they see and they see this and they feel this. In Elisha's case, it wasn't a feeling thing or an emotional thing alone or a dream thing alone. There was the contact with God and you could see the result. What was the result? He was able to tell the king of Israel, and not once or not twice, but he was able to tell the king of Israel multiple times the movement of the army, what is it that was going to take place, right? And so Elisha had results for his relationship with God. And that just leaves a question for us. Is there any result of our relationship with God? Or is it that we are theorizing? And might I use a phrase, we are emotionalizing our relationship with God. What do we have to show for our relationship with God? How does God communicate with us? And how true does the communication come through? And what are we able to contribute to our own spiritual lives and the spiritual lives of others because of our relationship with God? Elisha was able to spare Israel from certain destruction because there was a heads up as to what the Syrian army was doing. And then came the fearful servant, trembling probably no doubt, feeling that this modern Syrian army was going to devour us. Not only devour us, but devour this prophet, Elisha being the prophet, and everything he said come to pass, and every directive he give make good sense. But here come an army encompassing the whole city, not even the little town, not even the little district, not even in one house, or in lane, or in street, but then surround the whole city to take care of Elisha. When you are in a position that you are doing God's will and God's work, there's going to be enemies. And the enemies not necessarily people in church, and they don't necessarily people at the workplace. We don't necessarily know where they're coming from. So we must get into the habit of picking on people, because there's the thought of enemy. Then it must be you, and it must be me, and it must be my brother, and it must be my sister. So the servant was fearful. But this is what I'd like for us to give an answer to. Elisha prayed and asked God, and that is verse 17. He prayed and he said, open the eyes of the servant. Now, my question is it that there was a physical army, or was there a spiritual army, so that the servant could not see the army before, but after Elisha prayed, he was able to see? What are our thoughts in terms of the type of army? Was it a spiritual army, or was it a physical army? Or what would have been the problem of the servant? That he's not able to see on one occasion, but he's able to see on the army on another occasion. Any thoughts? Somebody is answering? Somebody over here? Yes. You think it was a spiritual army? All right. Okay. Yes, brother.
So, but the first army, sir, was the aggression.
The Syrian army, yes.
Which was a physical army that
yes.
he could see.
Yes.
But the Lord's army was more of a spiritual army that he wasn't able to see with the naked eye.
You think it would be that? All right. Anybody else? Well, let me tell you this. Go ahead, camera. Tell me why you think so. I'm so interested in hearing what you say, but I'm afraid you can pull out the mask and speak a little louder like when you give me a sister trouble. Move your hand and speak a little louder. Oh, okay, good. So that's the first army that Brother PJ was asking about. So you're right in that sense, but there was another army that the servant did not see initially. Let me read. And Elisha prayed and stood. Verse 16. And he answered, fear not, for that's Elisha talking to the servant, for they that be with us are more than them, than they that be with them. And 17 said, and Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray thee, open his eyes, that he may see. And the Lord opened his eyes, the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. Alright? Alright, so tell me now. Anybody else? What type of army you think it was? Yes. The Syrians. Yes. Yeah. 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 Well, I mean, looking a little closer at the scripture, it may have been a heavenly army, a spiritual army that was sent. But initially, my thought was that it was a physical army. And I'm thinking that what could have taken place is that the servant was so full of fear that he couldn't even see good work on. Or he was so taken up with the fact that it's them going to have to manage this big old army that is arrayed against Elisha. But there's something else to note, that the army of Syria had only two characteristics that the scriptures describe. That they had horses and they had chariots. But verse 17 describes what else the army that was supposed to be defending Elisha had. Anybody took note of that? Huh?
Yes, sir. You tell me what? Fire, sir.
Yes, they were chariots of fire. So therefore, from even the preparation, God ensured that there was superiority in preparation to defend his servant. That is how God operates. So, whether the servant was able to see or not, whether it was a physical army or a spiritual army, and it is probably of importance, but not so much important, what type of army it was. What was important is that in the time of trouble, though, when the Bible said, though an host encamped, anybody know that scripture? Yes, it's a host of an army that encamped around this one man. But God found it necessary to respond with a kind of brutality. And I mean brutality in a positive sense, not negatively brutal. God decided to respond that here, to defend this one man. I am going to bring out the best of heaven. Because if it requires the best of heaven to defend this one man against the army of the enemy, that is what I'm going to do. And so he said, you have chariots, you have horses, but I am going to send my chariot with fire. So when you start to look at when the poor servant, I get home, because as servant and as him looking through human lens, what he's seeing is an army on a mountain top. And he knows how effective the Syrian army was. Probably he knew that they use modern weaponry and they are effective and they will leave enemy and that sort of thing. He probably knew. And so he was right as human to be fearful and to become concerned. And I can imagine the language in their day that we use. The equivalent to our language is probably, Lord God, what we are going to know. Elisha, you don't see up on the hill what taking place. And Elisha just chill and say, look here, just relax, man. They're going to do something for you that you are able to now see the goodness of God. I am going to ask God. And that's part of what Elisha did. Elisha, if I was Elisha, probably I would go and say, relax, man. We have this under control. Be in touch with God and I will show you some things will take place. Elijah didn't do that. He didn't boast and he didn't suggest that it was because of his might or his power or his strength. He said, I am going to consult God because already I know what the circumstances are. And because I know I'm going to ask God to show you what I know. I'm not going to rebuke you. And I'm not going to tell you that ye of little faith and you have no sense and you're too afraid. I'm going to talk to God to fix your little problem. And so that spirit or that environment of fear that the servant had. Immediately God demonstrated that when you're representing